Welcome viewers, good morning. This is the CEC live lecture series, and we are running a series of lectures on world literature, and already the term has been defined, and world literature, for instance, signifies a kind of unified voice and reflection in literature of humanity as a whole. And in this series we have covered Africa, and now we are doing Latin America. And today's lecture is on Marquez as a fiction writer, and he is associated with magical realism. And for this lecture we have Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English in the department in Hindu College, Delhi University, and she has done extensive work on Shakespeare, on modern Indian writing in English, and the associated areas. Before I request her to begin the lecture, viewers, let me tell you that we are available on the toll free number 1-800-110-430, and this number can be used for asking questions towards the end of the lecture. Precisely at 9:50 onwards you can ask the questions, and Dr. Richa Bajaj will be glad to respond to the observations and comments that you make. Let me repeat the number again. The toll free number is 1-800-110-430. And now I request Dr. Richa Bajaj. Dr. Bajaj, welcome, and please start your lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Anand Prakash. Welcome viewers once again. Today we will be discussing the novelist, the short story writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is a known name in Latin American literature. When discussing Marquez, we are going to look at first the concerns, the kind of fiction that he writes, and then go into the discussion of the different novels provided the time that we have. We'll have a view of the works that he has written. So when we begin, as we begin about, and this is a series, ongoing series, and we are right now touching upon Latin American literature that has been written in the 20th century particularly, then this is an area which is which has remained in a kind of an insulated and isolated area. In the world, we have seldom heard much about it. We have seldom seen much work coming from there. It is only in post 1950 that Latin American literature has received some kind of focus or a focused attention of critics as well. Now you see, this is also because the Hispanic American literature, as we call it, also is something that has become more determined and has gained a kind of sharp edge in the 1950s or so, post that period. But it is also because you see, an important development in Latin America that needs to be highlighted is the Cuban Revolution of 1959, post which the region gains a kind of a fillip. It's like a boom literature that comes. It's actually referred to as the boom phenomena in Latin American literature, which refers to this kind of rebellion coming from writers who try to register protest, who are and Marquez was one of them. He was of course the most progressive amongst the boom writers, so to speak. But most of these writers, they try to rebel against the conventional way they were looked at, in the conventional way in which they were looked at by the rest of the world. And in fact, they also tried to bring to focus their kind of life. Also because they were not actually ever focused upon. It was almost like this part of America, this South America, did not, as if it never existed, and this was a kind of a well-guarded secret of the United States in many ways, because it was the backyard of United States. It was where exploitation took place, and on a very large scale, of natural resources. So it was this safe secret of United States that never came out in the open. For us, it was an obscure area, and for many others, in fact, South America was an obscure area. It was totally isolated, and we had no clue. It was, and why I use the word insulated also, because it was well guarded. There was not much could reach the other world. There was absolute disconnect between Latin America and the rest of the world. While 20th century, saw a lot of revolutions around the place, this section of America almost always had dictators, and this is for one, and and how they lived, in an era which was ruled by dictators. For instance, Marquez wrote a novel called The Autumn of the Patriarch, which actually discusses, which is about a monologue of a dictator who has lived for 123 years, who has dictated for 123 years and is now going to be executed. So it's like, this Marquez, and even what is interesting about this area is that things don't happen for a day, for months, or exploitation, violence doesn't take place for a couple of months or a couple of years. There are centuries that are, they're like sweeping centuries. Here Marquez, when he talks about his other novel, which is of course the novel that he's most well known for, 100 Years of Solitude, he charts this a century of living of the people in Latin America. Again, in The Autumn of Patriarch is about 123 years, and it's about that, and in that he's able to encapsulate many dictators, whether it was the Somoza regime or others. He's able to talk about all the different regimes, all the different dictatorships that Latin America has faced, and how people have survived, and how their stories have never made way. In fact, they have never been seen as documented histories in the rest of the world. So, that is something that we need to look at. That is something that becomes the focus area for Marquez and many writers of this region. So we need to remember that how South America was a kind of a block that was left for us, in a way that was imprisoned in the American or the United States view of the world, and how it came to the fore post the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Post that period, writers started writing about their lives. They tried to connect to the world. They tried to tell the world what their stories were. And and soon enough you have Nobel Prize writers there. You have Pablo Neruda, who gets the Nobel Prize, and even Marquez receives it. So you see, the point is that their literature then gets the kind of recognition that that was not provided to them in before 1950s or so. So that is something we need to remember about the region, how that region has remained sort of isolated and in a period of solitude, in fact, and that in a way brings us to Marquez's novel as well, which is 100 Years of Solitude, and it gets a kind of definition. What does he mean by solitude? So he's actually talking about Latin America that has till now lived in solitude, and it's not a self-imposed solitude, but it is a kind of solitude that has been imposed by the imperialistic power, that is the United States, that is using this region as its backyard, as its where it could plant its forces, as a region where it's inflicting violence and the world doesn't know about it. So that side of life needs to be brought about or brought in, and is brought about in Latin American literature. Now coming back, so that is about the region, that is something I thought that we should be aware of. And the second thing then that one has to remember when we are dealing with Gabriel Garcia Marquez is that is his kind of writing. What is he writing about? I mean, he's writing a kind of, is he writing a history? It's his, and particularly here my reference is to 100 Years of Solitude, but that is true for almost everything as he has written. He, and again, if he's again another novel that he has written, Love in the Time of Cholera, is about a love affair that actually is consummated after, it takes decades to consummate. So again, the time span in Marquez is never a short time span. It's always a sweeping decades or centuries or 300 years, so it's that range and that kind of canvas that he builds, that he sweeps across centuries. But then is he is he a realistic writer, because he's sweeping across centuries, talking about 100 years, talking about 150 years, about the 16th century, about the 20th century? Is he really talking, is it realistic writing? Yes, it is a kind of realistic writing, but it's a different kind of realistic writing. Now, of course, the term magic realism has often been applied in the case of Marquez, and the idea is that it's not that Marquez was the first to use magic realism, but he used it in a very different form, and he didn't use the technique of magic realism as an end in itself. He had something to say. He wanted to bring to the center certain aspects of reality that did not necessarily connect, and perhaps so when we talk about magic realism, then we need to understand a couple of things. So let's try to see it from 2-3 different angles. The first is, when Marquez uses magic, then he's not doing it just as a kind of a entertainment value, just to add some technique in his work, which could be there. It adds to the value and we can't take that away from it. Having said that, we have to remember that magic works as a kind of the first instance, it works very well when you want to discuss the tradition of a country which has a lot of superstition in it. So superstition instantly gets connected with magic, that certain things happen, and there are coincidences. You can call them coincidences, but you can also call them superstition, and there is a magical element attached to it, that you think that this is going to happen and something happens. So there are predictions, there are coincidences, there are superstitions. All these gel well with the idea of magic realism. Now, of course, when we are talking about magic and realism, the two words as such, it seems to be a kind of an oxymoron to say it's realism and yet magic. If it's magic means fantasy, magic means that something supernatural is taking place, and realism means material, matter, tangible, everything you can see, touch and feel. So how do you connect these? It's that kind of opposites coming together. And is it just a technique in Marquez, or is he actually trying to suggest a very a dialectical approach to life? Is this dialectics of life that he is also trying to find in technique? Now, what is dialectics? That, well, if one thing exists, the opposite of it also exists, and both are true and both coexist, right? And that is the dialectical movement of time, that you can't say that history only went in this direction. It went in this direction, but then it also went in the other direction. And if it went in two directions, then how do they come together? They do come together. So opposites can come together. They may have a relationship of conflict. They might coexist for a brief moment in time and then fall away. So that's the nature of dialectics. Now, when Marquez uses magic realism, then it gives him that opportunity to talk about opposite things. He's in one moment realistic down to the most fine detail, and in the other he sweeps across centuries, as I said, and sweeps across time, sweeps across space, travels in imagination. So he's using everything around, as the mind would want to use. So he gives freedom to his mind. He gives freedom to his art from the very fine realistic details, because that's the idea of realism also that we need to understand. I think that realism over the years in the 20th century, as it came to be understood, was that realism must always talk about that which one can see, which one can feel, the matter, the concrete, that is tangible and that is palpable. But the point is that realism did not begin from that point. Realism means that something that is true. It may, and if you feel it, then it is true for you. So you may not see it, you may not be able to touch it, and yet it is realistic. So, but over the years in the 20th century, realism became was bracketed and structured in a way that it came across as a kind of a movement that only could permit concrete details and would keep out anything that is a little obscure, that is a mind. So for realism, mind is also matter, right? And mind is not outside the sphere of realism. So if mind exists, then everything that happens in the mind also exists, and if whatever the mind weaves then is also true enough. And when we are talking about, so that aspect also is a part of realism, but somehow in the 20th century critics have bracketed realism as a kind of a cliched term which is only restricted to the physical aspects of things and physical descriptions of things, and they have left out the imaginative sweep that can also be included in realism. An important part of realism that is seldom touched upon is that realism believes in talking about the hidden layers of society, or the hidden layers of things, or those aspects which have meaning but are not available on the surface. So, and when one explores in detail, when one explores the depths of it, that's when you find the truth. And to finding that, you can't really find physical route to it. You necessarily need to take help of imagination. So I think in the 20th century, that aspect of realism has somehow been lost out, has been kept out, and therefore realism appears a very structured, concrete term, a term that means writing which is absolutely concrete and physically available, etc. Now, so magic realism is actually an extension of that realism, and here when Marquez again goes into the hidden layers of society, tries to talk about the unexplored, etc., but by not just, and he then takes recourse to magic in a way. And magic here doesn't mean that there's a magician out there. Of course, there is the first aspect that I was talking about magic realism, was that it connects well, it gives superstition a kind of base to stand on. Certain things happen, there are people, there are gypsies who come to the town of Mekondos in 100 Years of Solitude, and they come and they set up their tents, and they bring about these carpets that can fly, and the initial head of the family, Jose Arcadio, with his sons, he goes to the gypsies, and he finds them, he finds some person turned into a snake, he finds another person who's flying on the carpet. So of course this weaves in well with the superstition and the kind of myth and the kind of legacy that one hears of in 19th century, 18th century. Certain things happened. Now of course he's able to give that value to superstition, that they saw such things. Now that adds to the superstitious quality. The other aspect of magic that Marquez uses in his literature is not necessarily superstition, but the other side, which is the mental faculty of the mind. In fact, the character of Aureliano, who's Jose Arcadio's son in 100 Years of Solitude, you note that this person could, had this power of predictions. He could tell beforehand if something was going to happen. So there is an instance where he says that somebody is coming to our house. I don't know who, but I can tell you that somebody is. While his mother is trying to rationalize it, find a logic to the situation. He's able to make predictions. At one moment, he's able to move objects. He's able to move a pot, and if not move a pot, at least predict that this pot is going to fall. So you see, that is another power that he's able to give to his characters. Now that's another kind of magic that he adds to his stories. One was of course the one that I mentioned about superstition, about that kind of life. The second being characters with certain powers, that he's giving them certain powers to be able to predict certain things, just as this man does, or just as Aureliano does. A third example is of course Marquez, who is the gypsy head, who is a close friend of Jose Arcadio in 100 Years of Solitude again, who is again who's able to come back from the dead, as they say in the text. Now the idea is that he's using science. So that's another kind of magic that Marquez talks about, that he's using equipments, he's using science to help him to rejuvenate, to help him to get back to life. And there's a time when in the novel 100 Years of Solitude, there's a time when everybody is afflicted with insomnia, the plague of insomnia. Now that the plague itself is very magical, you see. So it's not that there is any one definition of magic in Marquez. That's something that we need to understand. He is using this at many places to indicate many different things. That is something that one has to remember. So in one case it helps him to talk about superstition, in other case it lends a kind of heroic quality and extra quality that he gives to a character. In the third case, he's talking about science and technology and inventions and progress that is coming in the village, and particularly through the gypsies such as Marquez. Melquiades is the one who actually brings a portion of a medicine, and that's again magic for the villagers, because the whole town is afflicted with the plague of insomnia, and he brings this portion, a light green portion, which he gives first Jose Arcadio to have, and they are cured. The whole town in fact is cured of insomnia because of that magic portion, as they call it. Now the point is whether that is magic or that is science. Science to that generation, to that period, that the people who lived in that period, to them science is also a kind of magic. That certain, in fact, when the first magnets are brought by the gypsies to the village, then they because it could draw everything, all metals to itself, then they felt that, oh, this was magic, and therefore they understood that the gypsies are always associated with supernatural qualities and magical qualities. So science also is given that, for the first timer it's a kind of a magic, and science is not science at that time. It's later on when they can get connected with technology that they understand the significance of these inventions. So that's the third kind of magic that you find in Marquez. Now the fourth, there's another, and I'm sure when you go read the text, you'll find so many different places where magic could be interpreted in a different manner. Now the other aspect in which the other aspect that he uses magic for is completely certain things that are totally inexplicable. He also uses magic to that effect, to suggest that certain and that is something about realism again, that realism doesn't mean giving answers. It doesn't mean that you need to get to answers. It is about suggesting that reality is complex. It is about suggesting that reality can't be understood in and framed and expressed in a sentence and said that this is it, this is why they did it. Now, and Marquez as a journalist would know it best. Marquez started his career in journalism first and then moved to writing fiction. Now, as a journalist, he would know best about these things, because when you read a story, when you have an actual event, then there are so many loose ends to that story. You really don't have answers to all those loose ends. You don't know the cause. You don't know why somebody who committed a murder, you don't know why that person committed murder. You don't know if some event takes place. You don't know who was responsible for that event. So journalism is all about probing and prodding. It's all about scraping the surfaces and trying to find connections, and this is exactly what he's doing in his novels. He's just trying to find connections, and at certain moments certain things flash, at other moments other things flash, they don't make sense, but then the journalist is trying to find a connection, and find a connection in as he would find in life. So that is also a very integral part of realism, that and Marquez's brilliance as a novelist lies in this particular fact that he doesn't give you ready-made answers. The narrator stops short where answers are. He in fact will leave at that point and say, well, strangely something happened, well, strangely this thing took place, because he makes it appear strange and inexplicable, and therefore forces the reader to find that answer, because he's taken you, because he has you in the grips of the narrative. So you have an answer in your mind already, but when he doesn't give you the answer, then you are forced to add your own answers to those situations. Then what could have happened? What could have led to this situation? So the reader becomes involved in the process of reading as also interpreting, and Marquez deliberately leaves those places open for the reader to interpret. So he's not one to give you ready-made answers and tell you, well, this is why it happened, and satisfy that kind of need in you to get to the end of the situation or get to the end of the problem. So that is something that Marquez deliberately does, and that is a part of his realistic technique. And here strangeness also is a kind of adds magical element to the story. Like for one instance, there is this girl who flies out of the window. Now that nobody can explain it, nobody has any clue why that happened, and Marquez doesn't give you anything to support that, and there's no rational argument, no logic given to that kind of a event. So and then another aspect of magic, and there are so many shades of magic here, magic as seen as myth. The figure of Aureliano, who turns, there are again and this is another aspect which I wish to come to when we discuss the novel 100 Years of Solitude as a kind of history of Latin America. But before I do that, then one has to understand that Colonel Aureliano Buendía, he becomes a kind of a myth for the country, because he's turned into a revolutionary leader in the process when he's fighting against the conservatives. And so his mythicization, his kind of mythification that takes place is also a kind of magic. Certain people, so there are stories and there are rumors that do the rounds that he has been killed. The others say no, that he's still alive. So again, coming back to life as he's dead or he's alive. So these are, and very close to Melquiades, who also comes back to life in the text. So these are instances that one has to keep in mind when one is dealing with magic realism, and and I'm sure you will find many more places where you find magic being used by the writer. So when we return after the break, viewers, will discuss certain other themes of Marquez's writing and take into account some textual details as well.
Well, viewers, in this part of the lecture, Dr. Richa Bajaj has spread her net quite wide. She has gone extensively into the nature and characters and characteristics of magic realism, and these will be dealt with a view to focus upon the reality, the magical reality that is there in Marquez's fiction. Till then, you have to wait. Thank you. Welcome, viewers, back to the lecture, and this is the second part, and in this part the points that have been earlier explained will be taken further into the text that is there of the fiction that we are discussing of Marquez. So back to the discussion, and I request you to please continue with the lecture.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Anprakash. Welcome back, viewers. So we were discussing Marquez as a novelist here, and we touched upon the aspect of magic realism in the first half, and now I wish to look at the idea of history as it develops in Marquez's fiction. Now, a lot of critics have actually looked at 100 Years of Solitude, the novel that he's famous for, the most famous for, as a kind of history of Latin America. Now, the point is that how it's a kind of a different kind of work that you would see. So it's not on the face of it history. He doesn't claim anywhere that he's talking about Latin America. In fact, the towns, the places, people appear often fictional characters, imaginative figments of them, that have been provided to us by the writer. And yet there are instances that when you come out of the fold of the text, that you can connect with Latin American life. Now, and it is also to highlight the kind of complexity and the kind of entangled kind of life that is there in Latin America, where things somehow come together. Now, the interesting part about his fiction is that time is an important notion in Marquez. Now, two things that I am going to begin with here is time and history. Now, he's talking to as a kind, if we look at it as a kind of history of Latin American life, then we expect a kind of chronology, then we expect a kind of linear progression of time. But what you find in Marquez is that time coexists, different time periods, the time that is past and the time that is present coexists in many ways. Also, at the same time, if you notice his novel 100 Years of Solitude, and before you start reading it, there's a map that is given to us. The map, which is a kind of a family tree actually, where you see that the head of the family is Jose Arcadio Boendia and Ursula, his wife, then their sons Jose Arcadio, Aureliano, and Amaranta, and then there are the tree kind of grows, and it becomes confusing. Even if you read the family tree, then you are confused, because they always name their children as either Arcadios or Aurelianos. So all the sons, so there are different variations, the last one being Aureliano Babylonia, and in between you have this Jose Arcadio Segunda, and all these others characters who keep on figuring in, and so the girls, of course, Rebecca, who just comes into the text and is not a part of the family, but she joins the family, and Amaranta is there. These characters are there, but what I'm trying to say is that the repetition of names, just as Jose Arcadio, the Arcadios are meant, keep on, a number of Arcadios come, the Aurelianos, number of Aurelianos join the family from the first to the last. There is an idea that first of all, why is the writer using the same set of names? One, it could be a part of their custom to keep using the father's name and adding another another name to it, and then the family tree goes on. The other is, and the second way of interpreting is, that Marquez is actually trying to tell you that time, there is no difference between the first and the last Arcadio. There is no difference between the first and the last Aureliano. It's a kind of a vicious circle that you enter, and it's a kind of a life that you enter where all the Aurelianos coexist, all the Arcadios also coexist. So suggesting that the time passed, that the past man is actually living in the present person. So when you read about the Aurelianos, you always remember Colonel Aureliano, the first that was there, or even before Jose Arcadio, the Aureliano, the father of the family. Now the point is that, so you have somewhere in your memory, somewhere in the corners of your memory, you always remember that there was another Arcadio, and that Arcadio finds space in the present child that is born, or the new man that has now come to the center of the narrative. So all these characters, so the idea, it's almost like one man is playing different parts. In drama, if we look at it, then it's like one man who's playing the different parts. You always remember that man is the same, but the characters have changed. So it's that kind of twist that Marquez is trying to bring in, to suggest that times actually coexist. The other instance of time coexisting is and that is more simple to understand, because it is given to us straight away from the text in 100 Years of Solitude, is when the last Aureliano Babylonia, he finds the manuscript of Melquiades. Now Melquiades has in his own time, when he was friends with Jose Arcadio, remember Melquiades is the first gypsy who comes to the village, and he becomes very thick friends with Jose Arcadio and the family, and he keeps visiting them, and they there is news that he dies, but then he comes back to life, etc. In one instance, when he comes to the house of Ursula and Jose Arcadio in Macondo, he actually writes out a parchment in Sanskrit, and this parchment he writes about, it's a kind of a history of the family that only becomes that is revealed to Aureliano Babylonia at the end of the novel. He is able to decode the script and read it, and when he reads that script, then he realizes that everything that was going to happen till his time, even Aureliano Babylonia's mention, is there in Melquiades' narrative, which was written 100 years ago. And 100 years ago, how the century is going to pan out for this family, how this family is going to live out, how it's going to be finally be wiped out of and disappear, the entire race of the Boendias would disappear, was also mentioned in the narrative. In fact, when the epigraph of that manuscript says that the first would be tied to the tree and the last would be eaten by the ants, and we know that the first is Jose Arcadio, who goes mad and who's tied to the chestnut tree where he sits and where he stays all through, and the last child who's born with the pigtail, we are also aware that this last child is being eaten by the ants. So it's in a way the narrative was in a way visualized earlier by Melquiades, and is now it gets revealed to Aureliano. Now, when Aureliano Babilona reads the narrative, he says at one point that Melquiades wrote this history of 100 years of his family not as a kind of chronology, but all things happened together. Let me point that out to you from the text so that there is a kind of a textual reference as well. Now, so I quote, and this is Aureliano. So, the exact phrase which I mentioned about the epigraph which is written on the parchment was, the first of the line is tied to a tree and the last is being eaten by the ants. This is the epigraph of the parchment, that the manuscript that Melquiades has left and which is found by Aureliano here in the last part of the text. Now, when he reads it, he realizes that, and I quote, it was the history of the family written by Melquiades down to the most trivial details 100 years ahead of time. He had written it in Sanskrit, which was his mother tongue, and he had encoded the lines in the private cipher of the Emperor Augustus and the odd ones in the Lacedaemonian military code. And then it goes on, unquote. And here again he goes on to say that Melquiades had not put events in the order of man's conventional time, but had concentrated a century of daily episodes in such a way that they coexisted in one instant, unquote. So, this is what I wanted to talk about, that they don't follow the man's conventional time, but that he had concentrated a century of daily episodes in such a way that they coexisted in one instant. At this point, actually, I'd request Dr. Anand Prakash to give his view on time and history as it has been used in Latin American fiction, and what Marquez means to suggest through it.
I would like to go with your kind of interpretation, which presents a mixture of time and the details of life. There is a problem also that I am facing as I listen to the lecture, and that problem is that this country is a backward country. This continent is a backward continent, which don't have any kind of tradition, a long tradition of knowledge, learning, scientific development, and that they see things as mixed. They see things as happening, as coexisting, and this shows that these people seem to have made a virtue of necessity. They don't have much to know. They've seen the same thing happening again and again. They take it as reality, and then they start interpreting it. And by interpreting it, somehow they create a kind of explosion in the middle of the details, so that all things fall around. And then when they come back, after flying, when they come back and settle down on the ground, then they form their own pattern. So this dazzles, and more than dazzles, this draws attention of people. Now they want to understand what is history, what is linearity about it, what are things that are human made and that which are come from somewhere else. So it's a place of wonder. It's a place of magic, and that magic compels you to think and make sense of it. So I would interpret it this way, and I'll go by your overall understanding of the argument, which is that there is a lot of conscious element by people like Marquez to go into these details, which otherwise would be entirely traditional and mythical, as you say. How do you respond to this?
Yeah, two things that I thought are interesting here. One is interpretation, as you say, that things fall in a pattern and then they are left to be interpreted. But I also think what Marquez is the master of also giving characters as also readers, this opening up for a wishful interpretation of events. In fact, his other novel, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, talks about wishful interpretations.
How is wishful real then?
Exactly, that's the point. Is wishful real? The point is, and that's wishful is the magical element to the real. That that reality which you wish for is also real, and needs to be created
as the wish of an actual person.
Right. So the wishes. So it's wishful interpretation of these different events. But again, this, and that's where it gets more complex, because there is a sense of tragedy also in that wishfulness, because even as characters wish for certain things, like in 100 Years of Solitude, the senior Jose Arcadio, he's always wishing to find a connection, a route that connects with the outside world, and he seems to go around, he tries 100 times and fails. So heroism and failure in Marquez, they are one and the same.
You talk of tragedy,
right,
and pain. Do you also talk of death there? Do you see death there?
Of course. You see, when you see 100 Years of Solitude, then it ends in a kind of tragedy, because the entire race disappears. The house is taken in a whirlwind, and nobody would remember the text. Now, let me read out the last line of the text, and that in a way is what tells you that it ends on that kind of a sad note. And this says that before reaching the final line, however, he had already understood that he would never leave that room, for it was foreseen that the city of mirrors or mirages would be wiped out by the wind and exiled from the memory of men at the precise moment when Aureliano Babylonia would finish deciphering the parchments, and that everything written on them was unrepeatable since time immemorial and forevermore, because races condemned to 100 years of solitude did not have a second opportunity on earth. That's how
this is spreading the expanse of the meaning, and this shows that things, one can go back to those things again, and they can be visualized then.
No, but he's saying there is that, they didn't have a second opportunity, and they are condemned to solitude, and nobody will remember. They'll be wiped out from the memory of men. This entire novel would be wiped out from the memory of men. That's what the narrator is suggesting. The idea is that the entire history of that region has been wiped out. There is another instance again of how events are just totally wiped out, and that is when the banana massacre takes place of 1928, which actually takes place because of the United Fruit Company, which is a US company, and which sets up its unit and in the region, and it's fictionalized, it's given a fictional representation in 100 Years of Solitude. And there you see that and Marquez in the novel tells us that 3,000 workers were actually killed in that period, and there is only Jose Arcadio Segundo who's the only survivor who's not massacred. But when he comes out and tells people, nobody believes him, nobody accepts him.
This loss of memory then, this loss of memory is very useful for the American entrepreneur.
Yes, it is very the loss of memory or the wiping out of certain events from the memory works very well for the imperialistic powers. But then when in the banana massacre case, as I say, nobody believed that such a thing happened. So it's that for them it's a kind of magic again. It's something that happened and nobody recorded, and for them it never took place. So it's
how are birds, how are forests, how are waters, rivers and ocean, how are they understood in the novel? Are they there?
Yes, they are there, and they are there as assisting the human venture or human beings at that point. And whether it is, and that they're also turned into business. You see, the moment they find the route to the world, that is the Macondo people in Macondo, and that's when Ursula actually finds the route to the world, which Jose Arcadio was looking for, and he could not find it, but his wife Ursula finds. Then she comes back with a group of set of people who are connected, who are connected to the mail every day, who are in touch with the outside world about inventions, etc. And she starts a business of animal candies. So animals also turn into a kind of business. Till then they lived in a kind of community and were only used in the house for for cattle and for rearing, for milking, etc.
So violence, death, destruction all become subjects of exploitation.
Yes, that is true.
Something to sell. So
Yes,
something to create a condition in which people do not resist. They merely accept it as a part of life.
Yes, and that is something that I think Marquez is steering clear of. He doesn't want to give that kind of idea, because Latin American fiction, Latin American writing also has tried to work out that kind of thing. They have seen violence and exploitation as a result of civilization. So many Latin American literature before Marquez has actually also tried to look at the two as in a state of conflict. There is barbarism on one side and civilization on the other, and as one moves towards civilization, then there is a kind of exploitation and violence. And so this gives rise to also something which is called regionalism in Latin American fiction. You know, writers have moved to a more regionalism kind of have moved to writing about the region and focusing upon the region and trying to get away from civilization. So that has also been the mainstay of a lot of fiction, but Marquez is deliberately trying to steer clear of this kind of binary that exists between civilization and barbarism, because in fact he is able to build a kind of humanism through his characters. And this humanism is not just being, you know, is of course community living, where everyone is helping one another, everyone's building the towns by, you know, with the help of one another and following the route that is given. And here again Jose Arcadio plays a major role. He's the patriarch of the village. He's an enterprising man who sets up the village, who builds houses in a manner that no house gets more or less sunlight, etc. So it's a kind of community living that he's talking about. But at the same time, he's also talking about this very basic human urge, you know, that exists, that is to explore, and that is to strive and to also test one's capabilities. All these characters, whether it is Jose Arcadio or later Aureliano and others, they're all testing their capabilities, you know, and going by their human urge.
Okay, let it come, please. Yes, please let it come.
Hello.
Yes.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, ma'am.
Yes, good morning. Yes, please ask your question.
Yes, ma'am. Sir, my name is Pawan.
Yes, Pawan.
Sir, I want to know about the style of writing of Marquez.
Well, I'll put your question, Dr. Riza Bajaj, but she has talked about the style and she may repeat a few points. So there is a gentleman from Varanasi who wants to know something about the style of Marquez. So please tell.
The style is not linear, it is dialectical. In some cases, it is also trying to build a kind of concentric circles around the novels. The novel keeps going back and forth, so there are a lot of fragments that he is using to build up his narrative. He is also using, in terms of style, the technique of magic realism, which I explained in detail in the first half of this lecture. Apart from that, when we talk about form and when we talk about style, then he is weaving different stories simultaneously into the narrative, and these stories are of people who have lived 300 years ago, people who have lived in the 19th century, and people who have lived also in the 20th century. So, you know, he's weaving these different stories, and these stories are all cutting across space and time. So that is also another part of his narrative technique that he's using.
So Pawan, I hope you have got the answer to your question. This is what the style is. The style is to, you know, not go according to the linear movement of time, but, you know, bring different things together and through them create a pattern. So this is what he does, and he does it beautifully well. It's most fascinating, and I think you have got the answer to your question. Thank you, Pawan. And coming back to our discussion that we are having, how come that this fiction, which is supposed to be of a corner of the world, now has you know, acquired center stage, and people are, you know, giving more and more importance to it, and are accepting it as something which is essential to the, you know, modern writing?
Yes, because, you know, there's so much that is happening in Latin America that one is that the world is absolutely been unaware of, and has been that region has been in the dark for such a long time, and how sanctions had been imposed, how economic misery was there. Also, one more thing was there, that, you know, there was an idea given that you know, the regions which were controlled by the US were flourishing. In fact, you know, so Latin American fiction actually tells you the other side, the economic misery that has been caused by this kind of imperialistic practice of the United States, and what the people had to go through, the kind of violence they had, the kind of armed struggles they had to wage against you know, armies that were deployed, that were supported, that were funded by the US in the Latin American region. Also, you know, the practice of the United States to enter into the Panama region and thereby find a route to control what they called communist regimes that were spreading in Latin American region. So, you know, this fight, one fight which is a kind of a civil war, here too, you know, one instance that I'd like to talk about from 100 Years of Solitude, you know, there is a mention of the 1000-day war in the text, and that is the 19th century war that took place between the conservatives and the liberals. And here, and Colonel Aureliano Buendia then actually becomes a revolutionary leader in that movement, and finally, you know, he loses interest in the movement and he signs the peace treaty and comes back home. But the point is that how he is able to add history to the lives of people. History in Marquez is not an outside phenomenon. You know, it is something that is lived by characters. It is something that people actually are a part of, and that is something that becomes clear to us in the 20th century as we read it. Now, that is the endeavor of writers such as Marquez, who's writing in 1967 and so late, you know, to talk about the history of their region and to talk about it not as a simple narrative, but as a series of events, as characters have lived out that history.
Would you say that the sense of history has been instilled into the imagination of these people through you know, acts of revolution, as in Cuba? Was that the starting point?
You see, that is the starting. That gave the fillip, and post 1959, which is the Cuban Revolution, you have these spate of writers who are just, as I talked about the boom phenomena also, who are trying to rebel against all the notions that till now have been, you know, provided to Latin America. In fact, their own Latin American literature has, you know, tried to work out the duality between realism and modernism, between also universalization of life. You know, so they have also had a kind of traditional conservative approach in literature, which changes remarkably and dramatically in the 1960s or so. And among these revolutionary writers, Marquez is the most progressive of them, because he is able to turn that history into a kind, you know, there's a kind of anger in Marquez that is often missing in other, a kind of constructive anger, I would say. There is anger in all other boom phenomena writers, but then that anger is leaves them in a state of helplessness as well, takes them in a kind of self-destruction. You know, they don't see much hope, because they go into realism so much. They are not able to, and once they go into the realistic mode also, they realize that no hope is possible for Latin America. There's so much of violence, so much of tragedy, that they are left discontented, and they seem to not find any hope anywhere. But that's not the case with Marquez. There is a sad tone, there might be tragedies, but there is the heroism of the people and of the country, and the anger, the constructive anger, the positive anger that I was talking about. That is something that Marquez actually is able to provide in his novels.
Which means that in his novels, he is talking about those processes which led to the development in Cuba and in other countries like Argentina,
yes,
where, you know, there were progressive movements.
Right.
So this process would have begun sometime in the 19th century, you say?
Yes, yeah. See, the span of 100 Years of Solitude is from 1820s to 1920s. That's the period that it is spanning. So yes, of course, he's referring, definitely he's picking up from 19th century. But even when he talks about 19th century, there are instances where he goes to the 16th century also, talking about the great-great-grandmother of Ursula, you know, and how they got together. So, you know, references to history and to the past are often made by the writer.
They are mentioned by name?
Yes, the actual names of characters who existed in the 16th century, and then he comes to the 19th century canvas, and further on moves towards the 20th century and how things shape towards the end of the narrative.
So would you call it creative history then?
Yes, it is. It is a kind of a creative history. It's a kind of a it's a history of the country, but used in a very creative fashion, and given to us in a creative form, and with the help of many imaginative areas that are provided by the writer.
Would you call it the biography of a continent?
Yes, of course, it is a kind of biography of the continent.
Because the cultural factors, the people, the heroic figures, all of them, you know, contribute to the development of magical realism, and that realism, you know, which finally explodes and shows, you know, the reality. Is that the case?
Yes, that is the case. That is certainly the case. But, you know, that's one kind of writing that we are talking about. If you look at Marquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold, then it's a very different kind of writing. So much of violence. There's a character whose guts are being culled out and thrown, you know, so that kind of violence also you find in there, and the town is complicit in the murder of Santiago in that sense. So, you know, it's not that he's giving you biography of a nation and always looking positive, but he's also suggesting how in an entire community, how an entire society can be held responsible. So it's not that he's just giving a history, he's also putting the blame on certain groups.
He is also perhaps problematizing history.
Yeah, and problematizing and also putting the blame on where it should go. He's not letting the, he'd give the blame in 100 Years of Solitude, he would put the blame squarely on exploitation that comes from imperialist past. In Chronicle of a Dead Foretold, he puts the blame squarely on the community that is living, that is equally privy to the situation, and they're all aware of a murder that is going to take place, except for the man who is going to be murdered. Everybody in the town knows about the murder and they're talking about it. So in a way, the whole town is responsible for that act of violence that takes place. So this kind of anger where he has the intellectual and the moral courage to put the blame where it belongs is something which is only available in Marquez.
That I would say is the apt summing up of magic realism and of Marquez. It talks about the conditions in Latin America, and it talks about potentialities of change in that continent, and that is all captured in the fictional mode, and that it is this that has made Marquez one of the foremost writers, one of the foremost voices of Latin American writing. So I'm sure viewers, you had a different take on Latin American writing, which is bordering on heroic, bordering on struggling, and that it is reinterpreting the world in a different manner. So thanks Dr. Richa Bajaj for this lecture, and thanks viewers, and please go into these questions in your mind and think more about them. Thank you.